Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a realm that every mortal soul must eventually visit. Not the bright halls of Olympus or the raging battlefields of heroes, but something quieter, more inevitable, and strangely more peaceful than the stories often tell. We're exploring death itself, or rather, the god who embodied it. The Greeks called him Thanatos, and his name alone was enough to make mortals fall silent. But there's more to this figure than simple fear. There's beauty, there's mystery, and there's a story that helps us understand how an entire civilization made sense of the one certainty that binds us all. If these ancient tales from the shadows help you drift into dreams, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly bring you peace. And if you'd like to support our journey through mythology's quieter corners, your presence here means more than you know. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, what time it is where you are, and whether the darkness outside your window feels as gentle as Thanatos' touch was meant to be. There's something oddly comforting about sharing these old stories across time and distance, all of us settling in together to remember a God who was never meant to be frightening at all. So, dim the lights. Let the ancient world take shape in your mind. Settle in, and let's begin with the birth of death itself. The birth of death, when night gave form to the inevitable. You might think that death, being so fundamental to existence, would spring from Zeus himself, or perhaps from the very first gods who shaped the cosmos. But the Greeks understood something profound. Death didn't come from order or light or the bright pantheon that ruled from mountain peaks. Death came from the darkness that existed before everything else. Death came from night. Thanatos was born from Nyx, the primordial goddess who embodied night itself. Nyx was not simply a deity of darkness. She was one of the first beings to emerge from chaos at the beginning of all things. When there was nothing but formless void, Nyx took shape from that emptiness, bringing with her the first shadow, the first absence of light, the first hint that existence could have different states, different faces, different endings. Some ancient sources say that Erebus, the personification of darkness and shadow, was Thanatos' father. Erebus was Nyx's consort in some tellings, another primordial force born from chaos. Together, night and darkness created something inevitable, something that would touch every living thing that would ever exist. But other sources claim that Nyx bore Thanatos alone, through parthenogenesis, needing no mate to bring forth this essential force. There's something fitting in that. Death needs no partner. Death simply is. The genealogy matters more than you might think. By making Thanatos the child of these primordial forces, the Greeks were saying that death existed before the gods themselves, before Zeus and his siblings overthrew the Titans, before humans walked the earth, before anything we would recognize as civilization or story or meaning. Death was woven into the fabric of existence from the very beginning. It wasn't a punishment or a mistake, or something that could be avoided with the right prayers or sacrifices. It simply was part of being. Thanatos had many siblings, and their names tell you everything about the Greek understanding of existence's darker corners. His twin brother was Hypnos, the god of sleep, and we'll come back to that profound pairing. But Nyx's other children read like a catalog of everything humans fear and endure. There was Garrus, the personification of old age, that slow decay that takes you bit by bit. There was Moros, doom itself, the inevitability of fate catching up with you. Oasis embodied suffering and misery, while Momus represented blame and criticism, the wounds that words can inflict. Apate was deception, and Nemesis was retribution, divine punishment for those who grew too proud. Eris, perhaps the most famous of Thanatos' siblings, was strife and discord, the goddess whose golden apple would eventually start the Trojan War. And then there were the Keres, sometimes called the Death Fates, female spirits who reveled in violent death and bloodshed, the carrion crows of the battlefield who drank the blood of the fallen. This family tree is dark, yes, but it tells us how the Greeks organized their understanding of hardship. All these forces, these difficult aspects of existence, they came from the same source. Night gave birth to them all. And among them, Thanatos stood as one of the most powerful, one of the most inevitable, because while you might avoid strife, or deceive retribution, or escape suffering for a time, you could not escape death. It waited for everyone. But here's what's remarkable. Despite being born from darkness, despite having siblings, hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into a realm that every mortal soul must eventually visit. Not the bright halls of Olympus or the raging battlefields of heroes, but something quieter, more inevitable, and strangely more peaceful than the stories often tell. We're exploring death itself, or rather, the god who embodied it. The Greeks called him Thanatos, and his name alone was enough to make mortals fall silent. But there's more to this figure than simple fear. There's beauty, there's mystery, and there's a story that helps us understand how an entire civilization made sense of the one certainty that binds us all. If these ancient tales from the shadows help you drift into dreams, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly bring you peace. And if you'd like to support our journey through mythology's quieter corners, your presence here means more than you know. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, what time it is where you are, and whether the darkness outside your window feels as gentle as Thanatos' touch was meant to be. There's something oddly comforting about sharing these old stories across time and distance. All of us settling in together to remember a God who was never meant to be frightening at all. So dim the lights, let the ancient world take shape in your mind. Settle in, and let's begin with the birth of death itself. The birth of death, when night gave form to the inevitable. You might think that death, being so fundamental to existence, would spring from Zeus himself, or perhaps from the very first gods who shaped the cosmos. But the Greeks understood something profound. Death didn't come from order or light or the bright pantheon that ruled from mountain peaks. Death came from the darkness that existed before everything else. Death came from night. Thanatos was born from Nyx, the primordial goddess who embodied night itself. Nyx was not simply a deity of darkness. She was one of the first beings to emerge from chaos at the beginning of all things. When there was nothing but formless void, Nyx took shape from that emptiness, bringing with her the first shadow, the first absence of light, the first hint that existence could have different states, different faces, different endings. Some ancient sources say that Erebus, the personification of darkness and shadow, was Thanatos' father. Erebus was Nyx's consort in some tellings, another primordial force born from chaos. Together, night and darkness created something inevitable, something that would touch every living thing that would ever exist. But other sources claim that Nyx bore Thanatos alone, through parthenogenesis, needing no mate to bring forth this essential force. There's something fitting in that. Death needs no partner. Death simply... The word itself, Thanatos, comes from the Greek verb meaning to die. It's the root of so many English words we still use today. Thanatology is the study of death and dying. Euthanasia, good death, the mercy of ending suffering. Thanatophobia, the fear of death. Even the medical term for death, thanatosis, carries his name. For thousands of years, every time we speak of death in clinical or philosophical terms, we invoke this ancient god's name, often without even knowing it. In the beginning, there was chaos, and from chaos came night, and from night came death, and from death, in a way, came the awareness that life had boundaries, that time was precious, that every moment mattered because there would be a last moment. Thanatos didn't just end life. In a strange way, he gave it meaning. Without him, without that boundary, existence would be fundamentally different. The Greeks understood this. They didn't love Thanatos, but they respected what he represented, the end that gave shape to everything that came before it. So when Thanatos took his place among the gods, he wasn't a villain in their cosmic drama. He was simply necessary, unavoidable, inevitable, the shadow that follows every living thing from birth, patient and persistent, never cruel, but never negotiable. And somewhere in the darkness of his mother's realm, in the primordial night that existed before even the stars were kindled, Thanatos waited, working, doing the job that no other god wanted, but every mortal would eventually need. The nature and domain of Thanatos, understanding death's quiet work. The ancient Greeks didn't think of death as a single monolithic thing. They understood that there were different kinds of endings, different ways a life could close, and they created different entities to embody these various deaths. This is where Thanatos' role becomes more specific, more nuanced, more interesting than simply being the god of death. Thanatos was specifically the personification of peaceful, non-violent death. When someone died of old age, having lived their full span of years, it was Thanatos who came for them. When someone passed quietly in sleep, when illness took them without violence or spectacle, when the thread of life simply ran out as the fates had decreed, Thanatos was there. His was the gentle touch, the soft transition, the ending that came with dignity and something approaching grace. This distinction mattered enormously to the Greeks. Violent death, death in battle, death from murder or accident or the brutal chaos of war, this fell under the domain of his sisters, the Keres. These female spirits, daughters of Nyx like Thanatos himself, were the exact opposite of their brother's gentle nature. The Keres were bloodthirsty and terrible. They haunted battlefields, waiting for the moment a warrior fell so they could lap up his blood. They were depicted with fangs and dark wings, their clothing stained with gore, their eyes hungry for carnage. Homer describes them in vivid, unsettling detail, and soldiers feared them more than they feared death itself. So, when the Greeks spoke of Thanatos, they were making a choice. They were acknowledging the death that comes for all of us eventually, the natural ending, the death that, if we're fortunate, we might face with some measure of peace. This wasn't the violent death that could strike at any moment on a battlefield or in the dangerous world of ancient Greece. This was the death that waited until your time was truly done. Now here's where it gets slightly complicated, because Thanatos is often confused with Hades, and understanding the difference tells us a lot about how the Greeks organized their cosmos. Hades was the ruler of the underworld, the lord of the dead, the administrator of the afterlife. He was Zeus's brother, one of the three powerful sons of Kronos who divided the cosmos among them after overthrowing the Titans. Hades got the underworld, Zeus got the sky, and Poseidon got the seas. Hades was royalty, an Olympian god of immense power. But Hades didn't kill people. That wasn't his job. Hades received the dead. He judged them, or oversaw the judges who did. He managed the vast realm of the afterlife, where souls dwelled for eternity. Hades was more like a king presiding over a kingdom that everyone eventually joined. He didn't go out into the world of the living and fetch souls. He waited for them to come to him. That was Thanatos's job. Thanatos was a psychopomp, a guide of souls, though he shared this duty with several other figures, including Hermes and sometimes Charon the ferryman. When your time came, when the Moirai, the three fates who controlled every mortal's lifespan, decided your thread was cut, Thanatos was dispatched to collect you. He would appear quiet and certain, and lead your soul down to Hades' realm, where it would be judged and assigned its eternal resting place. Think of it this way. Hades was the lord of the dead world, but Thanatos was the mechanism of death itself. Hades ruled over the destination. Thanatos managed the journey. They worked together as part of the cosmic order, but they were very different entities with very different roles. Confusing them would be like confusing a king with the executioner. Both are part of the system of justice and order, but they occupy very different positions within it. Thanatos lived, appropriately enough, in the underworld itself, though he traveled constantly to the surface world to perform his duties. Hesiod's Theogony places his dwelling at the edge of the world, in the land of eternal night, where his mother Nyx also resided. The sun never touched this place. No light of day ever penetrated its boundaries. It was shadow and silence, and the deep quiet when all activity ceases. And from this darkness, Thanatos would emerge, cross the boundary between the living world and the realm of death, and do his work. The Greeks rarely talked about Thanatos directly. They didn't pray to him, didn't build temples in his honor, didn't make sacrifices to win his favor. This wasn't because they didn't believe in him. It was because acknowledging death too directly, speaking its name too freely, felt dangerous. There was an old superstition that naming something gave it power, drew its attention. Mortals preferred to refer to death obliquely, through euphemisms and careful language, hoping that if they didn't invoke Thanatos by name, perhaps he would forget to come for them, at least for a little while longer. But come he would. That was the whole point. Thanatos was inescapable. The poet Aeschylus wrote that Thanatos was the only god who did not love gifts. You could not bribe death. No sacrifice would persuade him to pass you by. No prayer would move him to grant an extension. Persuasion herself, the goddess Peitho, stood aloof from Thanatos. Words had no power over him. Wealth meant nothing. Royal birth bought no favors. When your time came, Thanatos arrived, and nothing in heaven or earth could stop him from completing his task. Almost nothing, anyway. There were two notable exceptions, two moments when mortals actually managed to cheat death, to outwit Thanatos himself. These stories became legendary precisely because they were so impossible, so audacious. We'll come to those tales in detail soon. But their very existence proved the rule. Thanatos could be tricked, but only by the cleverest of mortals, and only temporarily. Death might be delayed, but it could never be escaped forever. This is what Thanatos represented in Greek cosmology. Not cruelty, not punishment, not judgment, but inevitability. The end that comes for king and beggar alike, for hero and coward, for the virtuous and the wicked. Thanatos didn't care about your life story. He didn't judge whether you deserved more time or less. He simply carried out the decree of the fates. And when he touched you, your story ended, and the underworld claimed one more soul. The appearance of death, how the Greeks imagined the end. If you were a Greek living in the archaic period, around the time of Homer, and you heard stories of Thanatos, you would picture a specific kind of figure. Not the skeletal, scythe-wielding grim reaper of later European imagination, but something quite different, something that carried the weight of antiquity. In the earliest depictions, Thanatos appeared as an older, bearded man, solemn and dignified. He had wings, great dark wings that sprouted from his shoulders, necessary for his constant journeys between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. In his hand he often carried a sword, not a weapon of violence, but a symbol of the cutting of life's thread, the severing of the soul from the body. This sword was sacred to his office, and in Euripides' play Alcestis, one of our most detailed ancient sources for Thanatos, he is described as carrying this sword with him when he comes to claim a soul. But the most distinctive attribute of Thanatos in classical art wasn't the sword or the wings. It was the inverted torch. Picture this: a tall torch, the kind that would normally be held upright to cast light, but turned completely upside down, flame pointing toward the earth. This was Thanatos's most recognizable symbol, appearing in countless vase paintings, relief sculptures, and other. The Greeks rarely talked about Thanatos directly. They didn't pray to him, didn't build temples in his honor, didn't make sacrifices to win his favor. This wasn't because they didn't believe in him. It was because acknowledging death too directly, speaking its name too freely, felt dangerous. There was an old superstition that naming something gave it power, drew its attention. Mortals preferred to refer to death obliquely, through euphemisms and careful language, hoping that if they didn't invoke Thanatos by name, perhaps he would forget to come for them, at least for a little while longer. But come he would. That was the whole point. Thanatos was inescapable. The poet Aeschylus wrote that Thanatos was the only god who did not love gifts. You could not bribe death. No sacrifice would persuade him to pass you by. No prayer would move him to grant an extension. Persuasion herself, the goddess Pytho, stood aloof from Thanatos. Words had no power over him. Wealth meant nothing. Royal birth bought no favors. When your time came, Thanatos arrived, and nothing in heaven or earth could stop him from completing his task. Almost nothing, anyway. There were two notable exceptions. Two moments when mortals actually managed to cheat death, to outwit Thanatos himself. These stories became legendary precisely because they were so impossible, so audacious. We'll come to those tales in detail soon, but their very existence proved the rule. Thanatos could be tricked, but only by the cleverest of mortals, and only temporarily. Death might be delayed, but it could never be escaped forever. This is what Thanatos represented in Greek cosmology. Not cruelty, not punishment, not judgment, but inevitability. The end that comes for king and beggar alike, for hero and coward, for the virtuous and the wicked. Thanatos didn't care about your life story. He didn't judge whether you deserved more time or less. He simply carried out the decree of the fates. And when he touched you, your story ended, and the underworld claimed one more soul. The appearance of death. How the Greeks imagined the end. If you were a Greek living in the Archaic period, around the time of Homer, and you heard stories of Thanatos, you would picture a specific kind of figure, not the skeletal, scythe-wielding grim reaper of later European imagination, but something quite different, something that carried the weight of antiquity and darkness. In the earliest depictions, Thanatos appeared as an older, bearded man, solemn and dignified. He had wings, great, dark wings that sprouted from his shoulders, necessary for his constant journeys between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. In his hand he often carried a sword, not a weapon of violence, but a symbol of the cutting of life's thread, the severing of the soul from the body. This sword was sacred to his office, and in Euripides' play Alcestis, one of our most detailed ancient sources for Thanatos. He is described as carrying this sword with him when he comes to claim a soul. But the most distinctive attribute of Thanatos in classical art wasn't the sword or the wings. It was the inverted torch. Picture this: a tall torch, the kind that would normally be held upright to cast light, but turned completely upside down, flame pointing toward the earth. This was Thanatos's most recognizable symbol, appearing in countless vase paintings, relief sculptures, and other artistic depictions. The meaning was clear and poignant. An upright torch represented life, consciousness, the light of existence burning bright. When the torch was inverted, when the flame pointed down and began to gutter and die, that represented life extinguished, the light going out, the end of mortal existence. Sometimes Thanatos held other symbols. A butterfly might rest on his hand. So Thanatos became beautiful, almost serene. In Roman sarcophagi from the later period, he appears as a winged boy, very similar in appearance to Eros, the god of love. In fact, the iconography overlapped so much that sometimes you could barely tell them apart. Both were depicted as beautiful winged youths. The main difference was the torch. Eros held his upright, celebrating life and passion and the vital force. Thanatos held his inverted, marking the end of that force, but not cruelly, not with menace, just with a kind of gentle finality. There's a famous artistic motif from this later period: Thanatos and Eros together, mirror images, one representing the beginning of life's passionate journey, and the other representing its end. Sometimes Thanatos is shown with his legs crossed in a relaxed pose, leaning on his inverted torch, looking almost contemplative, even restful. Death as rest, death as peace, death as the end of struggle. It's a remarkably humane way to imagine the end of existence. In some depictions, Thanatos appears as a slumbering infant in the arms of his mother Nyx. Picture Night herself, dark and vast and ancient, cradling the god of death as a sleeping baby. It's an oddly tender image, suggesting that death is as natural and innocent as sleep, that it's been with us from our very beginning, nestled in the darkness from which all things emerge. The vase painters of Athens particularly loved depicting the famous scene from Homer's Iliad, where Thanatos and his twin brother Hypnos, sleep and death, working together, carry the body of the hero Sarpedon from the battlefield. Sarpedon was a son of Zeus who fought for Troy, and when he was killed in combat, Zeus ordered the twin brothers to retrieve his body and transport it back to his homeland of Lycia for proper burial. In these vase paintings, both brothers are shown as winged figures, solemn and dutiful, carefully bearing the fallen hero's body between them. They're not enemies or monsters in these images. They're doing sacred work, treating the dead with respect and dignity, ensuring that even in death, a hero receives the honor he deserves. So the Greek image of Thanatos evolved, but certain elements remained constant. The wings, necessary for his journeys between worlds. The inverted torch, symbol of life's light going out. The quiet dignity of his presence. He was never depicted as cruel or violent. Even his sword wasn't shown dripping with blood or raised to strike. It was a ritual instrument, ceremonial, marking his office rather than threatening violence. This matters because it tells us how the Greeks actually felt about death once they got past the initial fear. Yes, death was frightening. Yes, they avoided speaking of Thanatos directly. But when they did depict him in art and literature, they chose to make him not a monster, but a necessary worker, performing an essential function in the cosmic order. Beautiful in his own way, gentle in his approach, inevitable but not malicious. Death was something you might fear, but Thanatos himself wasn't meant to terrify. He was simply doing his job, and his job, while unwelcome, was a kind of mercy. The end of pain, the end of struggle, the final rest after life's labors. Thanatos and Hypnos, the profound bond of twin brothers. In all of Greek mythology, there might not be a more perfect pairing than Thanatos and Hypnos. Death and sleep. The twins born from night, mirror images of each other, performing related but distinct functions in the cosmos. The Greeks understood something profound about the relationship between these two states, and they expressed that understanding by making them brothers, twins, two halves of a whole. Hypnos was the personification of sleep, and his importance in Greek thought cannot be overstated. Sleep was sacred, mysterious, necessary. Every single night, humans experienced a kind of small death, a temporary cessation of consciousness, a surrender of control. You closed your eyes, let go of the waking world, and entered a realm of dreams and darkness where anything might happen. And every morning you returned, reborn in a small way, consciousness restored, ready to face another day. This nightly cycle of death and rebirth through sleep was one of the most fundamental human experiences. Hypnos had power that even extended to the gods. The famous story tells how he once put Zeus himself to sleep at Hera's request, allowing her to work her schemes while the king of gods lay unconscious. This wasn't easy. Zeus was the most powerful god, essentially omnipotent within the Greek cosmos. But Hypnos managed it, which tells you just how fundamental and powerful sleep was understood to be. Nothing, not even divine alertness, could ultimately resist the necessity of sleep. The connection between sleep and death was obvious to the ancient Greeks. Every night you experienced something like death. You became unconscious, unaware, vulnerable. Your daily life ended temporarily. You dreamed, which was like visiting another realm, ghostly and strange. And then, if you were fortunate, you woke up, returning to life. But someday you would close your eyes and not wake up. And it would be Thanatos instead of Hypnos who had claimed you, and there would be no morning return to wakefulness. So the Greeks called sleep the brother of death, and death eternal sleep. The connection was more than metaphorical. It was phenomenological, based on lived experience. What you felt as you drift off to sleep each night, that slow softening of consciousness, that gradual letting go, that's what death was imagined to feel like. Thanatos's touch was like falling asleep, only final. His brother Hypnos visited every night, preparing you, in a way, for the final visit that would someday come. So the Greeks called sleep the brother of death, and death eternal sleep. The connection was more than metaphorical. It was phenomenological, based on lived experience. What you felt as you drift off to sleep each night, That slow softening of consciousness, that gradual letting go, that's what death was imagined to feel like. Thanatos's touch was like falling asleep, only final. His brother Hypnos visited every night, preparing you, in a way, for the final visit that would someday come. The twins were depicted together in art, and these depictions emphasized their similarities while marking their differences. Both were winged. Both were young and beautiful in the later periods. Both had the power to make consciousness cease. But Hypnos usually held an upright torch or a vessel of sleep-inducing liquid, symbols of his temporary, renewable gift. Thanatos held his inverted torch or his sword, symbols of finality. The most famous appearance of the twins working together comes from Homer's Iliad, and it's a scene worth lingering over because it tells us so much about their roles. During the Trojan War, the hero Sarpedon, son of Zeus, is killed in battle by Patroclus. Zeus watches his son die and knows he cannot prevent it. Even the king of gods must bow to the fates, and Sarpedon's death was decreed. But Zeus can ensure that his son's body is treated with honor and returned to his homeland for proper burial. So Zeus commands Apollo, another of his sons, to remove Sarpedon's body from the battlefield, wash it, anoint it with ambrosia to preserve it, and then hand it over to swift messengers to carry him, of sleep and death, who are twin brothers. Homer's words are specific. They are twins. They work together. They're entrusted with sacred duty. Hypnos and Thanatos take the hero's body and fly through the night, carrying him across the sea to Lycia, where he can be buried with the full honors due to a fallen prince. This scene was depicted again and again in Greek vase painting. The artists loved it because it showed both brothers together, both fulfilling their sacred office, both handling the body with care and respect. In these paintings, you can often distinguish Thanatos from Hypnos by small details. Thanatos might wear darker robes, or hold his sword, or have a more solemn expression. But they're clearly brothers, clearly working in harmony, clearly performing one of the most important functions in the Greek world, ensuring the dead receive proper burial and honor. The philosophical implications of this brotherhood went deep. If death was sleep's brother, then dying was something humans had practiced every night of their lives. You already knew how to let go of consciousness. You already knew how to surrender control and slip into darkness. The difference was only one of degree, not kind. Death wasn't a foreign country, but a familiar one, a place your soul had touched every night in dreams. Only now you would go there and not return. This also meant that death, like sleep, could be seen as restful, even necessary. You needed sleep. Without it, you couldn't function. Your body required that regular period of unconsciousness to restore itself. Perhaps death was similar for the soul, a final rest after the exhausting labor of mortal life. This became a common theme in Greek epitaphs and consolations. He rests now, they would write. She sleeps. It wasn't just euphemism. It was genuine belief that death provided respite, an end to pain and struggle, just as sleep provided nightly relief from the day's burdens. Hypnos had a home, a cave in the underworld according to some sources, where poppies grew at the entrance, and the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, flowed nearby. No light penetrated this cave, and no sound disturbed its perfect quiet. It was the ultimate place of rest, and sometimes Thanatos was said to dwell there too, or nearby, the twins sharing that twilight space between consciousness and oblivion. In the Orphic tradition, which developed its own elaborate mythology around death and rebirth, sleep and death were sometimes described as gates that souls had to pass through. Sleep was the gate you went through every night and returned from every morning. Death was the gate you went through once and never returned from, at least not in the same form. But they were sibling gates, twin passages, both leading from the bright world of day into the darkness of night's realm. The relationship between Thanatos and Hypnos reminds us of something that modern Western culture sometimes forgets. The Greeks saw death as natural, even necessary, woven into the fabric of existence, just like sleep. They didn't pretend death wasn't frightening or sad. They mourned their dead intensely, with elaborate rituals and genuine grief. But they also understood that death was as natural as sleep, as inevitable as nightfall, as much a part of life as birth or breathing. And having Thanatos and Hypnos as brothers, twins born from the same primordial night, was the Greeks' way of expressing that in narrative form. Every night when you sleep, you brush against the realm of Thanatos. Every morning when you wake, you've returned from a small journey toward his domain. The twins are always there, always working, always present in the rhythm of human existence. One visits daily, bringing rest and dreams. One visits once, bringing the final rest, from which there are no more dreams, or perhaps, if you believed certain mystery religions, from which the greatest dream of all begins. Sisyphus was the king of Corinth, though in myth he's often called the king of Ephyra, which was the city's ancient name. He wasn't just any king. He was renowned across Greece for being the cleverest, most cunning, most quick-witted mortal alive. Stories circulated about his schemes and tricks. He'd outsmarted gods before, though that's what got him into trouble in the first place. The chain of events that led to Thanatos coming for Sisyphus began with a betrayal of Zeus himself. Sisyphus was the king of Corinth, though in myth he's often called the king of Ephyra, which was the city's ancient name. He wasn't just any king. He was renowned across Greece for being the cleverest, most cunning, most quick-witted mortal alive. Stories circulated about his schemes and tricks. He'd outsmarted gods before, though that's what got him into trouble in the first place. The chain of events that led to Thanatos coming for Sisyphus began with a betrayal of Zeus himself. The river god Asopus had a beautiful daughter named Aegina, and Zeus, in his typical fashion, abducted her, spiriting her away to satisfy his desires. Asopus searched everywhere for his daughter, desperate and grieving. Eventually, his search brought him to Corinth, where Sisyphus sat on his throne, watching and knowing things that others didn't. Now Sisyphus had no particular reason to protect Zeus's secret, and he saw opportunity in Aesopus's desperation. The king made a deal with the river god. "I'll tell you who took your daughter, but I want something in return. I want a spring, a source of fresh water for my city's Acropolis." Water was precious, always precious. Aesopus, in his grief and rage, agreed immediately. A spring burst forth from the rocks of Corinth's citadel, and Sisyphus, true to his word, revealed that Zeus himself had taken Aegina. Zeus was furious when he discovered this betrayal. The king of gods did not take kindly to mortals revealing his secrets, especially regarding his various conquests and abductions. Sisyphus had violated divine privilege, had spoken what should have remained unspoken. The punishment for this impudence was clear: death. Immediate, non-negotiable death. Zeus commanded Thanatos himself to go to Corinth, to enter Sisyphus's palace, and to drag the presumptuous king down to Tartarus, the deepest, darkest pit of the underworld, where the worst offenders against the gods were imprisoned and punished. So Thanatos came. Death itself arrived at the gates of Sisyphus's palace, black-robed and carrying his sword, ready to fulfill his duty. But Sisyphus was watching, waiting, expecting this. He was the cleverest man alive, remember, and he'd had time to prepare since betraying Zeus. He knew death would come for him. He was counting on it. What happened next has been told in several different versions, but they all agree on the essential outlines. Sisyphus somehow managed to trap Thanatos. In the most common version of the tale, Sisyphus noticed that Thanatos had brought with him a new invention. A pair of cunningly crafted metal shackles, handcuffs, made by Hephaestus, the divine craftsman. These were meant for Sisyphus to chain him up and keep him from escaping during the journey to Tartarus. Sisyphus played his role perfectly. He feigned honor at being visited by such an important god. He expressed curiosity about these novel restraints, these clever shackles. How did they work? Could Thanatos demonstrate? After all, Sisyphus had never seen anything like them. The god of death, perhaps surprised by this polite reception, perhaps a bit proud of his equipment, agreed to show Sisyphus how the shackles functioned. He put them on his own wrists to demonstrate the locking mechanism. And in that moment, Sisyphus struck. Quick as thought, he snapped the shackles closed and fastened them in place. Before Thanatos could react, the god of death found himself bound in chains meant for a mortal, trapped by the very restraints he'd brought to use on Sisyphus. The king didn't stop there. He also fastened a collar around Thanatos' neck, further securing him, then dragged the struggling god into his palace and locked him in a closet, a storage room, somewhere dark and hidden where no one would think to look. And just like that, death was imprisoned. Thanatos, the inevitable, the inescapable, the one who came for everyone without fail, was chained up in a mortal's palace, unable to perform his essential function. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. With Thanatos bound and imprisoned, no one could die, anywhere. The entire world faced this impossible situation. Old people, sick people, people in agony, people mortally wounded in battle, they all kept living. There was no release from suffering. Warriors fought and sustained terrible injuries, injuries that should have killed them instantly. But they remained alive, writhing in pain, bleeding but not dying, bones crushed but consciousness continuing. This went on for weeks, some sources say a month. The world descended into a kind of horror. Imagine battlefields full of men with fatal wounds who couldn't die. Farmers too old and sick to work, but unable to find rest. The seriously ill begging for an end that wouldn't come. The natural cycle had been broken. Birth continued, but death had stopped, and the imbalance was unbearable. The gods noticed, of course. They noticed because no one was dying, which meant no one was making the proper sacrifices and offerings to the gods. In Greek religion, you made offerings to the gods in part by sacrificing animals, and those sacrifices required the animals' deaths. With Thanatos chained up, even these ritual killings became impossible. The sacrificial animals couldn't die, even when their throats were cut. The gods went without their due offerings, and that got their attention fast. But one god was particularly bothered: Ares, the god of war. What was the point of war if no one died? Battle lost all meaning. Soldiers fought and fought, sustaining horrible injuries, injuries that should have killed them instantly. But they remained alive, writhing in pain, bleeding but not dying, bones crushed but consciousness continuing. This went on for weeks, some sources say a month. The world descended into a kind of horror. Imagine battlefields full of men with fatal wounds who couldn't die. Farmers too old and sick to work, but unable to find rest. The seriously ill begging for an end that wouldn't come. The natural cycle had been broken. Birth continued, but death had stopped, and the imbalance was unbearable. The gods noticed, of course. They noticed because no one was dying, which meant no one was making the proper sacrifices and offerings to the gods. In Greek religion, you made offerings to the gods in part by sacrificing animals, and those sacrifices required the animals' deaths. With Thanatos chained up, even these ritual killings became impossible. The sacrificial animals couldn't die, even when their throats were cut. The gods went without their due offerings, and that got their attention fast. But one god was particularly bothered: Ares, the god of war. What was the point of war if no one died? Battle lost all meaning. Soldiers fought and fought, sustaining horrible injuries, injuries that should have killed them instantly. But they remained alive, writhing in pain, bleeding but not dying, bones crushed but consciousness continuing. This went on for weeks, some sources say a month. The world descended into a kind of horror. Imagine battlefields full of men. So, Ares, god of war, savage and violent and short-tempered, went to Corinth himself. He stormed into Sisyphus's palace and searched until he found where death had been imprisoned. Breaking open the storage room, Ares released Thanatos from his chains, freed the god from the impossible indignity of being trapped by a mortal. The natural order snapped back into place. Death resumed his work. Everyone who should have died in that strange period immediately expired, their deaths rushing in all at once like a dam breaking. The world returned to its proper rhythm. And Thanatos, restored to his power and deeply humiliated by what had happened, immediately seized Sisyphus. The king was going to pay for this affront, this violation of cosmic order. Thanatos dragged Sisyphus down to the underworld, across the river Acheron, without even bothering with Charon the ferryman, and presented him to the judges of the dead. Sisyphus would face punishment in Tartarus for his crimes against the gods and against death itself. But Sisyphus had one more trick prepared. Before Thanatos had come for him, Sisyphus had instructed his wife, Merope, not to perform the proper funeral rites for him. Don't bury the body, he'd told her. Don't make the proper offerings. Don't do any of the things that should be done for a man who's died. Just leave my body in the public square, naked and unhonored. Merope, loyal to her husband, followed these bizarre instructions, though they must have pained her. So, when Sisyphus arrived in the underworld, he had a legitimate complaint. His wife hadn't performed the proper rituals. His body hadn't been treated with respect. This was actually a serious issue in Greek belief. The dead required proper burial rites to find peace in the afterlife. Refusing these rites was considered one of the cruelest things you could do. Sisyphus went to Persephone, queen of the underworld, wife of Hades, and told her this story. "My wife has disrespected me terribly," he said, all sorrowful indignation. "She didn't even bury my body. I'm suffering this indignity. Please, I must return to the world of the living to scold her, to make sure she performs the proper rituals, to ensure my body receives the treatment it deserves. Then I'll return immediately. I promise. I just need to correct this terrible wrong." Persephone, moved by his apparent distress, and perhaps not aware of who she was dealing with, granted his request. Sisyphus could return to life temporarily to sort out his funeral arrangements. He swore he would come back to the underworld once the matter was resolved. But, of course, once Sisyphus was alive again, breathing mortal air, feeling the sun on his skin, he had absolutely no intention of returning. Why would he? He'd escaped death twice now. He'd trapped death itself and then talked his way out of the underworld. He was the cleverest man who'd ever lived, and he'd proved it in the most spectacular way possible. So Sisyphus simply refused to die again. He went back to ruling Corinth, telling everyone about his incredible exploits, living on for years, growing old, but not returning to face his punishment. Eventually, inevitably, mortality caught up with him. Even Sisyphus couldn't live forever. When he finally died of old age, the gods made sure that this time there would be no tricks, no escapes, no clever arguments. They sent Hermes, the psychopomp, to drag Sisyphus's soul back to the underworld, and they made sure he arrived at his destination. And this time, Sisyphus would be punished. Not quickly, not mercifully, but eternally. The gods didn't just want Sisyphus dead. They wanted him to understand the futility of fighting against cosmic order, the impossibility of escaping what must be. So they devised a punishment that has become one of the most famous images in all of mythology. Sisyphus was condemned to roll an enormous boulder up a steep hill in Tartarus. His task was simple: get the boulder to the top. If he could do that, his punishment would end. But the gods had ensured it would never be simple. The boulder was enormous, almost too heavy to move. The hill was steep and treacherous, and most crucially, the boulder was enchanted. Every single time Sisyphus got close to the top, every time he thought he might actually succeed, the boulder would slip from his grasp, roll all the way back down to the bottom, and he would have to start over. Forever. He would push that boulder up that hill for all eternity, never succeeding, never earning release, never finding the clever trick that would let him escape this final punishment. The man who'd outsmart death twice would spend forever engaged in the most futile, most frustrating, most meaningless labor imaginable. The story of Sisyphus and Thanatos became legendary because it explored something fundamental about the human relationship with death. We all want to escape it. We all want more time. If we were clever enough, if we could just find the right trick, the right argument, maybe we could defer that final ending. Sisyphus represented that human impulse taken to its absolute extreme. He actually did it. He actually trapped death and escaped twice. But the story's ending reminds us that such victories are always temporary. Thanatos can be delayed, but never defeated. Death comes for everyone, even the cleverest king who ever lived. And the punishment Sisyphus received for his cleverness, that eternal labor without hope or purpose, became a perfect symbol for all meaningless, repetitive work. When we call something a Sisyphean task, we mean it's pointless, futile, a labor that can never be completed. Say slowly as a storyteller. French philosopher Albert Camus would later write a famous essay called The Myth of Sisyphus, using the story as a meditation on the absurdity of human existence. Camus imagined Sisyphus happy, finding meaning in the struggle itself, creating purpose through the act of rebellion against his punishment. But the Greeks weren't quite so optimistic. For them, Sisyphus's eternal boulder rolling was straightforward punishment, a reminder that you cannot cheat death. You cannot outsmart the cosmic order. And if you try, the gods will make sure you understand the cost. Thanatos, who had suffered the indignity of being chained by a mortal, eventually got his due. And Sisyphus, who had briefly seemed to prove that human cleverness could overcome even death itself, ultimately demonstrated the opposite, that death always wins in the end, and fighting against it only postpones the inevitable, while ensuring the eventual reckoning is that much more severe. Alcestis and the rustling of death, when even death can be overpowered. If Sisyphus's story shows us death outwitted by cunning, the myth of Alcestis presents us with something very different. Death overcome by strength and love, by the intervention of a hero willing to literally wrestle death for the soul of a good woman. This story, preserved most famously in Euripides's play Alcestis from 438 BCE, gives us our most detailed portrait of Thanatos as a character, speaking and acting and revealing himself to be more than just a shadowy presence. The story begins not with death, but with life extended. King Admetus of Pherae, in the region of Thessaly, was a good man, honorable and generous. He'd once employed Apollo as a servant, though neither of them knew it at first. This happened during one of Apollo's periods of exile from Mount Olympus. The god had killed the Cyclopus in revenge for Zeus killing his son Asclepius. And as punishment, Zeus had forced Apollo to serve a mortal for a year as a simple shepherd. Apollo ended up working for Admetus, and the king treated him with remarkable kindness, even though he didn't know his new shepherd was actually a god in disguise. This kindness mattered. When Apollo's year of service ended and he revealed his true nature, he wanted to reward Admetus for his decent treatment. So the god struck a bargain with the fates themselves. The Moirai, the three fates who controlled the lifespan of every mortal, had decreed that Admetus would die young. His thread was measured, and it was shorter than most. But Apollo, using his divine influence and probably a fair amount of wine, convinced the fates to modify their decree. Admetus wouldn't have to die at his appointed time if, when that time came, someone else volunteered to take his place. Someone had to die. The cosmic balance had to be maintained. But it didn't necessarily have to be Admetus himself. This seemed like a wonderful gift. Surely when the moment came, someone would volunteer. Admetus was a good king, loved by his people. He had elderly parents who'd already lived full lives. Surely one of them would offer to die in place of their son. Surely friends or advisors or someone would step forward to save a good king from premature death. But when the day came, when Thanatos's appointed time arrived, and word spread that someone needed to volunteer to die in Admetus's place, no one came forward. Not his elderly father, not his mother, not his friends or advisors or retainers. Everyone, it turned out, valued their own life too much to surrender it. Even for a king they loved, even for someone who'd been good to them. The old said they'd already earned their years. The young said they had too much life ahead of them. No one would volunteer. Except Alcestis. Alcestis was Admetus's wife, the queen of Pherae, and she loved her husband. More than that, she understood what his death would mean for their children, who would be left fatherless, and for the kingdom, who would lose a just ruler. So Alcestis did what no one else would do. She offered to die in her husband's place. Euripides's play opens on the day this exchange is meant to happen. Alcestis is dying, wasting away as her life force transfers to her husband. Apollo appears outside the palace, still present because of his friendship with Admetus, troubled and conflicted. He knows what's about to happen, and as he stands there, another figure approaches, Thanatos himself, arriving in black robes, carrying his sword, coming to claim the soul he's owed. This is one of the rare moments in Greek literature where death appears as an actual character, speaking and interacting. The exchange between Apollo and Thanatos is fascinating because it reveals so much about how the Greeks understood death's nature. Apollo, god of light and music and healing, tries to argue with Thanatos. "Couldn't you wait?" he asks. "Couldn't Alcestis have more time? She's still young. Let her live to old age, and then take her." But Thanatos refuses. He has a job to do, and he takes it seriously. "You helped Admetus cheat death once," he tells Apollo. "You got the fates drunk and tricked them into changing their decree. I won't let you twist things again with your clever words. What's been agreed must happen. Someone must die today." Say slowly, as a storyteller. Apollo warns Thanatos that a man is coming, a hero who will wrestle Alcestis away from death. Thanatos scoffs at this. He is death. He is inevitable and unstoppable. No mortal can defeat him. He enters the palace to claim his due. Inside, Alcestis dies surrounded by her family. She says goodbye to her children, makes Admetus promise he'll never remarry, asks him to remember her and honor her sacrifice. Then she closes her eyes, and Thanatos claims her soul, leading her toward the underworld. The palace falls into mourning. And that's when Heracles arrives. Heracles, the greatest hero of Greek mythology, son of Zeus, famous for his incredible strength and his legendary 12 labors, happens to be passing through Pherae on his way to one of those labors. He and Admetus are old friends, and Heracles expects hospitality and celebration. But Admetus is torn. Greek hospitality, xenia, was sacred. You always welcomed guests, always provided for them, always treated them well. To turn a guest away was a terrible breach of custom. But his wife has just died. How can he host a celebration when his household is mourning? Being a good man, Admetus decides to hide his grief. He instructs his servants to welcome Heracles without mentioning Alcestis's death. He'll honor his duty to his guest, even in his darkest hour. So Heracles comes in, all boisterous good cheer, expecting wine and food and fun. The servants do as they're told, but they're grieving, and eventually one of them cracks, revealing to Heracles what has actually happened. Heracles is mortified. He's been drinking and celebrating while his friend mourns his wife. He's violated the sanctity of a house in mourning. He's failed in basic decency. But Heracles isn't just embarrassed. He's determined to make amends, and he realizes something crucial. He's one of the very few mortals alive who has the ability to enter the underworld and return. He's done it before during his labors. He knows the way. So Heracles sets out to find Thanatos, to intercept death before Alcestis's soul is fully claimed by the underworld. He finds the god near Alcestis's tomb, where the funerary rites are being performed. And Heracles does what Heracles does best. He fights. The wrestling match between Heracles and Thanatos became legendary in Greek art and literature. Here was the strongest mortal who ever lived, grappling with death itself. Thanatos, for all his inevitability, was a god, and gods had physical form in Greek thought. They could be fought, touched, wrestled. Heracles seized him, and they struggled. hero and god locked in combat. And Heracles won. He overpowered death. Through sheer strength and determination, through the kind of heroic prowess that made him legendary, Heracles forced Thanatos to release Alcestis's soul. He wrestled death into submission and took back the woman who died, reversing what should have been irreversible. Heracles returns to Admetus with a veiled woman. The king is still mourning and doesn't want to see this mystery woman, doesn't want to seem to be replacing his wife so quickly. But Heracles insists. "Take her hand," he says, "lift the veil." When Admetus does, he finds Alcestis beneath the veil, returned from death. She's alive, but changed. She cannot speak. She will remain silent for 3 days, Heracles explains, until she's purified, until the taint of death has fully left her. After those 3 days, she'll return to being herself completely. But even silent, she's alive, and Admetus has his wife back. This story operated on several levels for Greek audiences. On one level, it was about the power of heroic virtue. Heracles represented the absolute peak of what a hero could achieve. If anyone could defeat death, it would be him. The story celebrated that kind of exceptional strength and courage. On another level, it was about the power of love and self-sacrifice. Alcestis volunteered to die out of love. Her sacrifice moved even the gods. Persephone, in some versions of the story, was so touched by Alcestis's devotion that she ordered Thanatos to return her even before Heracles intervened. The tale honored the kind of selfless love that would surrender everything for another. But on a deeper level, the story was transgressive, even troubling. The fates had made a deal. Someone had to die. The cosmic order required balance. By wrestling Alcestis away from Thanatos, Heracles was breaking that deal, violating the rules that governed existence. This was similar to the famous story of Orpheus and Eurydice, where Orpheus tried to bring his wife back from the dead and failed because he broke the conditions of his deal with Hades. Making bargains with death and the underworld was possible in Greek mythology, but breaking those bargains always had consequences. The play ends with Alcestis returned, but fundamentally changed. She's experienced death. She's been to the realm of Hades and returned. That marks a person. The 3 days of silence suggest she's caught between worlds. Not fully alive, not fully dead, gradually transitioning back to life as the underworld releases its claim on her. Some interpretations suggest she's not entirely the same person who died, that death has left its mark on her in ways that won't heal. And Thanatos, for the second time in Greek mythology, had been defeated. First, Sisyphus chained him, stopping death altogether. Now, Heracles had wrestled a specific soul away from him, reversing a particular death. These 2 stories became the most famous myths involving Thanatos, because they dealt with the thing humans most desperately wanted: to cheat death, to bring back the dead, to say, "No, not yet, not this time, not this person." But both stories also showed that such victories were exceptional, temporary, and came at a cost. Sisyphus's victory led to eternal punishment. Heracles' victory required the strength of the greatest hero who ever lived. And even then, the woman returned was not quite the same woman who died. Death could be cheated in rare circumstances by the cleverest or strongest of mortals, but the natural order always reasserted itself eventually. Thanatos always returned to his work. The inevitable remained inevitable, even if it could sometimes be delayed. The House of Death, Thanatos among the underworld powers. Before we explore how Thanatos appeared in literature and art, we need to understand his place in the complex hierarchy of the Greek underworld. Because death wasn't managed by a single god, but by an entire bureaucracy of divine and demonic beings, each with their own specific role in the great machinery of mortality. The Greek underworld was vast and complicated. It wasn't simply hell or heaven, but a complete realm unto itself, with geography and regions and populations and rules. At its head sat Hades, brother of Zeus, lord of all the dead. Beside him ruled Persephone, his queen, who spent half the year in the world above and half in the darkness below. These two were the royalty of death's domain, the ultimate authorities over the souls that came to dwell in their realm. But Hades and Persephone didn't personally collect souls or enforce the laws of mortality. That work fell to others, and Thanatos was chief among them. Think of Hades as the king, and Thanatos as his chief agent in the world of the living, the one who actually went out and brought the dead back to their eternal home. Hades rarely left his kingdom. Thanatos traveled constantly between the living world and the dead one, a bridge between realms, a boundary crosser who moved through the membrane between life and death with perfect ease. Other psychopomps, other guides of souls, also existed. Hermes Psychopompos, Hermes, in his role as conductor of souls, performed similar functions. Hermes was faster, could move between worlds almost instantaneously, and often appeared to guide the souls of the special dead, heroes and favored mortals whom the gods took particular interest in. Hermes was also a messenger god, a traveler by nature, so guiding souls was simply another form of his eternal motion. But Hermes didn't cause death. He appeared after death had occurred to help souls find their way. Thanatos was different. Thanatos was death itself, the mechanism by which life ended. Then there was Charon, the grim ferryman of the river Styx. Charon was crucial to the journey of the dead, but he appeared later in the process. Once your soul had been separated from your body by Thanatos and guided to the underworld's borders, you encountered Charon at his ferry dock. You needed to pay him, traditionally with a coin placed in the mouth of the corpse during burial. If you couldn't pay, if your family hadn't performed the proper rites, Charon would refuse you passage, and your soul would wander the banks of the Styx for 100 years before being allowed to cross. Charon was surly and ancient, often depicted as an old man with a scraggly beard, and he brooked no argument or plea. Pay the fare or wait your century. Those were the only options. Once across the Styx, souls encountered Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the gates of Hades. Cerberus's job was to prevent the living from entering and, more importantly, to prevent the dead from leaving. He was friendly enough to souls coming in, stepping aside to let them pass. But if a soul tried to escape, If anyone attempted to leave the underworld without permission, Cerberus would attack with all 3 heads, teeth bared, merciless. Very few things could get past Cerberus. Orpheus charmed him with music. Heracles overpowered him through strength during one of his labors. But for ordinary souls, Cerberus was an impassable barrier, ensuring that death remained final. Beyond Cerberus waited the judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. These were legendary kings from life, men so just and wise that after their deaths they were appointed to judge all other souls. They would examine your life, weigh your deeds, determine your character. Based on their judgment, you would be sent to your eternal destination. The virtuous and heroic might go to the Elysian fields, a paradise of peace and joy. Ordinary people, those who were neither particularly good nor particularly bad, went to the Asphodel Meadows, a gray twilight realm, where souls wandered without great suffering, but also without much joy. The wicked and those who defended the gods went to Tartarus, that deepest pit where eternal punishments waited. Thanatos' relationship with all these figures was professional and clearly defined. He worked alongside them, but didn't command them. Hades was his ultimate superior, the lord of the realm where Thanatos brought the dead. Hermes was something like a colleague, another psychopomp, but with different specific duties. Charon was the next step in the process after Thanatos completed his work. Cerberus ensured that Thanatos' work stayed permanent. The judges determined where the souls Thanatos delivered would spend eternity. But Thanatos also had siblings who worked in the underworld, and these relationships were more complicated. The Keras, those violent death spirits, were his sisters, daughters of Nyx like himself. They operated in different spheres. Thanatos claimed those who died peacefully. The Keras swarmed over battlefields and places of violence, claiming those who died in bloodshed. Sometimes their jurisdictions overlapped, and ancient sources aren't always clear about who had priority in ambiguous cases. A soldier who died quickly and cleanly, was that Thanatos' domain or the Keras? The texts don't always agree. The Moirai, the Fates, were also sometimes called daughters of Nyx, making them sisters to Thanatos as well. These 3 women, Clotho, who spun the thread of life, Lachesis, who measured it, and Atropos, who cut it, controlled mortality itself. Every mortal's lifespan was literally a thread they wove, measured and cut. When Atropos cut your thread, that's when Thanatos came for you. The Fates decided when. Thanatos enacted their decision. He was their agent, their enforcer, the mechanism through which their decrees became reality. Other underworld deities included the Erinyes, the Furies, who punished those who'd committed terrible crimes like murder or oath-breaking. They weren't under Thanatos' authority and didn't work with him directly, but they shared the underworld as their home base. They could travel to the surface world to pursue and punish the guilty, but they always returned to the depths when their work was done. Then there were lesser spirits and minor deities whose names have largely been lost. The underworld had geography, remember? Rivers besides the Styx. The Acheron, river of woe. The Cocytus, river of lamentation. The Phlegethon, river of fire. The Lethe, river of forgetfulness. Each had its own spirit or deity associated with it. The underworld had regions and territories, each with guardians and rulers. It was an entire cosmos underground, mirroring in its own dark way the bright world above. Thanatos' dwelling place within this realm was described by Hesiod as being at the edge, in the deepest darkness, where even the faint light that reached the underworld from above didn't penetrate. His home was shared or near his twin Hypnos, which made sense. Sleep and death lived together in eternal night. Hesiod's description paints a picture of absolute darkness and silence, a place of endings and rest, neither torture chamber nor paradise, but simply void, the absence of light and light. What did Thanatos do when he wasn't collecting souls? This is a question the sources don't really address, but we can infer some things. Death never truly rests. People are always dying somewhere, at every moment. The machinery of mortality never stops. So Thanatos was likely in constant motion, constantly working, traveling from the underworld to the surface world and back again, claim after claim, soul after soul. The work was endless but necessary. Without it, the cosmic order would break down, as it did when Sisyphus chained him. Some scholars have suggested that Thanatos and his role evolved over time in Greek thought. In the earliest periods, death might have been understood as more directly caused by the fates, with Thanatos being a later addition to explain the mechanics of how souls actually left bodies and traveled to Hades. By the classical period, Thanatos was firmly established as the active agent of death, but his importance in cult and worship remained minimal. Greeks didn't pray to him or build temples for him. He had no major festivals or public observances. He was too fundamental and too frightening to be approached that way. You acknowledged Thanatos existed, you respected his power, but you didn't seek his attention. Compare this to how the Greeks approached Hades. Hades had temples, altars, and proper worship, though still less than the Olympian gods received. But at least Hades could be propitiated, honored, bargained with in limited ways. Thanatos couldn't. As Aeschylus wrote, Thanatos alone among gods didn't love gifts and couldn't be persuaded. This made him both more frightening and less approachable than other death-related deities. The underworld hierarchy, with all its various divine and demonic beings, represented the Greek attempt to organize and understand death's complexity. Death wasn't simple. It had many aspects. There was the moment of dying, the journey of the soul, the judgment, the eternal destination, the question of proper burial, the prevention of escape. Each aspect had its own deity or spirit managing it. Thanatos managed the transition from living to dead, the actual moment of mortality. Everything else fell to other powers. But in that specific role, at that specific moment, Thanatos was absolute. When he touched you, you were no longer alive. That was his power, his function, his inescapable purpose in the cosmos. Thanatos in ancient literature and art. How the Greeks remembered death. To understand Thanatos fully, we need to look at how he appeared in the actual texts and artworks that ancient Greeks produced, because these sources give us the most direct access to how they really thought about death's personification. Our earliest surviving mention of Thanatos comes from Homer, the great epic poet whose Iliad and Odyssey formed the foundation of Greek literary culture. In the Iliad, Homer doesn't give us Thanatos as a character, but he identifies him clearly as the twin brother of Hypnos and describes them both carrying out a specific duty assigned by Zeus. This is the Sarpedon episode we've touched on before, but it's worth examining in detail because it shows Thanatos at work. Sarpedon, Zeus's mortal son, fights for Troy in the Great War. He's a good warrior, brave and noble, but his fate has been sealed by the Moirai. When Patroclus kills him in battle, Zeus grieves but cannot save him. Even the king of gods must submit to fate. Instead, Zeus ensures his son's body receives proper honor. Apollo washes Sarpedon's corpse, anoints it with ambrosia to preserve it, and then hands it to Hypnos and Thanatos, sleep and death, the twin brothers. Homer's language is specific and solemn. These are swift messengers, trusted servants of the divine order. They carry Sarpedon's body through the night sky, flying on their dark wings, and bring him back to Lycia, his homeland, where he can receive proper burial rites. This is Thanatos as sacred worker, performing an essential function with dignity and care. Hesiod, writing around the same time as Homer, or slightly later, gives us our most important genealogical information about Thanatos in his Theogony, the poem that laid out the origins and relationships of all the gods. Hesiod places Thanatos firmly as a child of Nyx, born from primordial night, brother to Hypnos, and to all those other dark forces that emerged from the earliest chaos. But Hesiod also gives us a crucial description of where these brothers dwell. And there the children of dark night have their dwellings, sleep and death, awful gods. The glowing sun never looks upon them with his beams, neither as he goes up into heaven, nor as he comes down from heaven. This passage established Thanatos's nature in Greek thought. He lived in eternal darkness, in a place the sun never touched. He was fundamentally opposed to light, to day, to the bright world of the living. This wasn't presented as evil, just as cosmic balance. The world had its bright side and its dark side, its living and its dead, and Thanatos occupied the necessary darkness. The most detailed portrait of Thanatos as a character comes from Euripides' play Alcestis, which we've already discussed. But it's worth emphasizing how remarkable this play is for giving death a voice and personality. Euripides presents Thanatos as austere, dutiful, somewhat cold, but not cruel. When Apollo tries to argue with him, Thanatos is firm and resistant to persuasion, but he's not mocking or sadistic. He simply has a job to do, and he intends to do it. He represents the absolute non-negotiability of death, the fact that no amount of pleading or clever arguing can change what must happen. Thanatos appears briefly in fragments from other Greek tragedies, most now lost. Aeschylus wrote several plays that featured death or the underworld, and surviving fragments quote characters speaking about Thanatos. One famous fragment from a play about Sisyphus has a character explaining how the crafty king bound death in chains, which tells us this story was well known and frequently dramatized. Another fragment from Aeschylus presents a wounded character calling out to Thanatos as healer, asking death to come and end his suffering. This presents death as relief, as mercy, as the only cure for unbearable pain. There's also a fascinating Orphic hymn to Thanatos, part of a collection of hymns to various gods and personified forces. The Orphic hymns came from a mystery religion that developed its own elaborate theology and practice. The hymn to Thanatos asks him to stay away, to not come before the proper time, but also acknowledges his power as absolute and universal. Hear me, O death, whose empire unconfined extends to mortal tribes of every kind. On thee the portion of our time depends, whose absence lengthens life, whose presence ends. This hymn captures the Greek understanding perfectly. Thanatos controls the length of every mortal life. His absence lets you keep living. His presence ends everything. You can ask him to delay, you can hope for more time, but ultimately he decides. Or rather, the fates decide and send him to carry out their decree. In visual art, Thanatos appeared frequently on Athenian pottery, especially in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. The most popular scene showed him and Hypnos carrying Sarpedon's body, the moment from the Iliad. These vase paintings give us our best evidence for how the Greeks actually imagined Thanatos looking. He was winged, bearded in the earlier depictions, carrying his sword, often dressed in dark or black robes. The vase painters made him and Hypnos distinguishable but clearly related, sometimes giving Thanatos darker wings or a more somber expression. One particularly famous vase, now in the British Museum, shows Thanatos and Heracles fighting over Alcestis. Thanatos is depicted pulling Alcestis's body from an altar, while Heracles confronts him with sword drawn. The god of death is not depicted as a monster or a demon. He's simply doing his job, and Heracles is forcibly preventing him. The visual captures the tension of that myth perfectly. Death as duty versus the hero's refusal to accept the inevitable. As Greek art evolved into the Hellenistic and Roman periods, depictions of Thanatos softened. He became younger, more beautiful, sometimes almost indistinguishable from Eros, except for his inverted torch. Roman sarcophagi, especially from the 1st through 3rd century CE, often featured Thanatos as a beautiful winged youth, sometimes even sleeping peacefully. These images reflected changing attitudes toward death and the afterlife. As mystery religions spread and ideas about rebirth and blessed afterlives became more common, death could be depicted as a gentle, even beautiful transition, rather than something to dread. The literary and artistic evidence all point to a consistent understanding. Thanatos was real, present, inevitable, but not malicious. He appeared when summoned by fate. He did his work without cruelty or pleasure. He could be feared, but he didn't deserve hatred. He was simply part of the cosmos, like day and night, like the seasons, like birth and growth and aging. The Greeks gave him form and story, not to make him less frightening, but to acknowledge him, to give him his due respect, to remember that death was as much a part of existence as life. and denying that truth would be foolish. The shadow that reaches through time. Thanatos in modern thought. Thanatos didn't disappear when the ancient Greeks faded into history. His name and what he represents have echoed through the centuries, appearing in unexpected places, shaping how we think and speak about death even now, more than 2,000 years after the last Greek genuinely worshipped the old gods. Say slowly, as a storyteller. Start with language itself. The Greek word Thanatos has become embedded in English and other modern languages, creating a whole family of words that we use without necessarily recognizing their mythological origin. Thanatology is the scientific study of death and dying, encompassing everything from the biological processes of mortality to the psychological and social aspects of how humans cope with death. Thanatologists work in hospitals, hospices, counseling centers, anywhere people confront mortality. They study grief, bereavement, end-of-life care. Every time they use their professional title, they invoke the ancient god of death. Euthanasia, from the Greek eu, meaning good, and thanatos, meaning death, literally translates as good death. The term refers to the practice of ending a life to relieve suffering, whether through action or by withholding treatment. It's one of the most ethically complex issues in modern medicine, but the very word connects back to the Greek understanding that not all deaths are equal, that there can be gentle deaths, merciful deaths, deaths that bring relief rather than tragedy. The Greeks distinguished between Thanatos's peaceful death and the Charis's violent death. Modern medicine makes similar distinctions between dying with dignity and dying in agony. Thanatophobia is the clinical term for an extreme, irrational fear of death or dying. It's different from the normal, healthy concern about mortality that most humans experience. Thanatophobia becomes debilitating, interfering with daily life, causing panic attacks or obsessive thoughts about death. Psychologists treating this condition are, in a way, helping patients come to terms with the very force that Thanatos personified, the inevitability of mortality, the necessity of accepting that life has an ending. Other medical and scientific terms carry the death god's name. Thanatosis is biological term for death itself, or for animals feigning death as a defense mechanism. Thanatoid describes something death-like or resembling death. Thanatophoric dysplasia is a severe skeletal disorder that's almost always fatal at birth, and its name literally means death-bearing. These technical terms, used in medical journals and scientific papers worldwide, keep Thanatos's name alive in contexts the ancient Greeks would never have imagined, but might have appreciated. They understood death as a natural phenomenon worth studying and naming. But Thanatos's most famous appearance in modern thought comes not from medicine or science, but from psychology, specifically from the work of Sigmund Freud and his followers. Freud didn't initially use the term Thanatos himself, but later psychoanalysts applied this name to what Freud called the death drive or death instinct, a concept he developed in his later career. According to Freudian theory, humans are motivated by two fundamental drives. There's eros, the life instinct, named after the Greek god of love, which encompasses all the drives towards survival, reproduction, pleasure, and creation. Eros pushes us to live, to build, to connect, to make things. But opposite to Eros, Freud proposed, there exists Thanatos, the death drive, which encompasses all the drives toward destruction, aggression, repetition, and ultimately self-destruction. Thanatos, in Freudian psychology, explains why humans sometimes seem to work against their own interests, why we engage in self-destructive behaviors, why we repeat patterns that harm us, why aggression and violence seem to be innate parts of human nature. The death drive pushes us toward destruction, sometimes directed outward as aggression toward others, sometimes directed inward as depression, self-harm, or the mysterious human capacity for self-sabotage. This psychological Thanatos became hugely influential in 20th century thought. It offered an explanation for the horrors of World War I and later World War II, suggesting that humans might have an innate drive toward death and destruction that civilization could only partially contain. It influenced art, literature, film, and political theory. When people talk about humanity's dark side or our capacity for violence, they're often invoking, whether they know it or not, this Freudian concept of Thanatos. The pairing of Eros and Thanatos, love and death, creation and destruction, became one of psychology's most recognizable dualities. It suggested that human nature contained both these drives in constant tension, and that mental health depended on balancing them, channeling them appropriately, preventing either from becoming too dominant. Too much eros might lead to manic episodes or dangerous risk-taking. Too much thanatos might lead to depression or violence. Health meant keeping both in productive balance. Whether Freud was right about this is still debated among psychologists. Many modern psychoanalysts have moved away from the death drive concept, finding it too speculative, too metaphysical, not sufficiently grounded in empirical observation. But the idea retains cultural power because it seems to explain something we observe. Humans do seem to have both creative and destructive impulses, both drives toward life and drives toward death. Whether this reflects an actual psychological structure or is just a useful metaphor, the fact that psychologists reached back to Greek mythology to name this concept shows how powerful those old stories remain. In philosophy, Thanatos appeared in existentialist thought, particularly in the work of Martin Heidegger and his concept of being toward death. Heidegger argued that authentic human existence requires acknowledging and accepting our mortality, that we must live with constant awareness that death awaits. This wasn't meant to be morbid or depressing. Instead, Heidegger suggested that awareness of death gives life meaning and urgency. If we lived forever, nothing would matter. It's precisely because our time is limited that our choices have weight, that we must decide what matters and what doesn't. This philosophical Thanatos, this acknowledgement of mortality as central to human existence, influenced writers, artists, and thinkers throughout the 20th century. Albert Camus, writing about Sisyphus, explored how humans create meaning in a universe that offers none, how we push our boulders uphill knowing they'll roll back down, and how this absurd struggle can actually be a source of freedom and joy. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about death as the ultimate boundary that gives shape to our freedom. These existentialists weren't worshiping death or celebrating it, but they were taking death seriously, acknowledging it as essential to understanding what human life means. In literature and art, Thanatos appeared as a character, a symbol, a theme. Romantic poets of the 19th century often personified death, sometimes drawing directly on Greek sources, sometimes creating their own versions. Victorian artists painted elaborate death scenes, often incorporating classical elements like winged figures or inverted torches. The pre-Raphaelites, fascinated by mythology, depicted scenes from Greek myths, including stories involving death gods. Modern fiction has featured Thanatos as a character in various forms. Neil Gaiman's Sandman series includes death as one of the endless, an ancient family of personified concepts. Gaiman's death, though not explicitly Thanatos, draws on the tradition of personifying death that the Greeks established. She's gentle, kind, understanding, helping people transition from life to death. This portrayal echoes the Greek understanding of Thanatos as not cruel, but simply necessary. Video games, particularly those dealing with Greek mythology, have included Thanatos as a boss character or important figure. In these depictions, he's often portrayed as more violent and antagonistic than the Greek sources suggest, because games need conflicts and battles. But his appearance in popular media, even when inaccurate, shows that the name and concept remain recognizable, that people still reach for Greek mythology when they want to depict death as a person or force. The Grim Reaper, that skeletal figure in black robes carrying a scythe, is sometimes thought to derive partly from Thanatos, though the connection is complicated. The modern Grim Reaper really emerged in medieval Europe, influenced by plague imagery and Christian eschatology as much as by classical sources. But the basic idea of death personified, death as a figure who comes to collect souls, that traces back through European culture to Greek sources, to Thanatos and his dark wings and inverted torch. What's remarkable is how the Greek understanding of peaceful death versus violent death has persisted in modern thought. We still distinguish between good deaths and bad deaths. We still value dying peacefully, painlessly, with dignity, surrounded by loved ones. That's Thanatos's domain, the death we hope for. We still fear violent death, sudden death, painful death, dying alone or in terror. That's the domain the keres represented. The Greek distinction between different kinds of death still shapes how we think and feel about mortality today. In contemporary death studies and end-of-life care, there's increasing focus on what researchers call death with dignity, or a good death. Hospice care, palliative medicine, advanced directives. These modern practices all aim to give people something like what the Greeks attributed to Thanatos: a peaceful passing, pain managed, consciousness gently fading, surrounded with comfort and love if possible. We've medicalized and professionalized it, but we're still pursuing the same goal: letting death come gently rather than violently, letting Thanatos rather than the keres claim us. Even our euphemisms for death echo Greek thought. We say people passed away or passed on, suggesting movement from one state to another, which mirrors the Greek understanding of psychopomps, guiding souls. We say someone went to sleep or is resting, directly invoking Hypnos and Thanatos, sleep and death as twins. We create elaborate ways to avoid saying someone died, just as the Greeks avoided speaking Thanatos' name directly. Different cultures, same underlying human need to soften death's harsh reality through careful language. The Greek gift to us through Thanatos and his mythology was a way to think about death that acknowledged its universality and inevitability, while also insisting it didn't have to be cruel or terrifying. Yes, Thanatos was feared. Yes, the Greeks mourned their dead intensely. But they also created a figure of death that was, in its own way, merciful, doing necessary work, ending suffering, bringing rest to the weary. That's a gift we still benefit from when we think about mortality today. Closing, the presence that waits. So now you know Thanatos. Not death in the abstract, but death as the Greeks imagined him, born from night, brother to sleep, the gentle hand that closes eyes for the final time when fate decrees. You know his stories, how Sisyphus chained him and Heracles wrestled him, how mortals could delay him but never escape him forever. You know his symbols, the inverted torch and dark wings, the butterflies and poppies that marked his presence. You know his role, not judge or punisher, but simply the one who comes when your thread is cut, who guides you from the bright world to the shadowed one. The Greeks understood something we sometimes forget: that personifying death, giving it form and face and story, makes it somehow more bearable. Thanatos was not random or meaningless. He was part of an order, a system, a cosmos that made sense even when it was painful. He had a mother and a brother and a job to do. He wasn't the enemy of life, but its necessary counterpart, the darkness that gave light its meaning, the ending that gave the story its shape. When you close your eyes tonight and drift toward sleep, you're touching the realm of Hypnos, Thanatos' twin. You're practicing the letting go, the surrender of consciousness, the trust that you'll return in the morning. The Greeks saw sleep and death as siblings because they understood both as natural transitions, different in degree but not in kind. One you do every night. One you'll do once, at the end. There's a comfort in that, strange as it might sound. Not in death itself, but in the Greek way of thinking about it. They didn't pretend it wasn't frightening or sad. They mourned deeply and grieved intensely. But they also accepted it as part of the pattern, woven into existence from the very beginning, when night gave birth to death in the primordial darkness. Thanatos was there at the start, and he'll be there at the end, patient and certain, doing the work that no one wants, but everyone eventually needs. So if these old stories have helped you tonight, if learning about Thanatos and his place in the Greek cosmos has brought you any peace or understanding, or at least a gentle distraction from modern worries, then perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's what these myths were always meant to do. Help us think about the hard things, the inevitable things, in ways that make them feel less alien, less hostile, more like part of the great story we're all living. If you enjoyed this journey through Greek mythology's shadows, like and subscribe to help others find these calm, historical explorations. And maybe, in the comments, share your thoughts on how different cultures have imagined death, or what comfort you find in these ancient stories, or just where you are in the world as you listen to tales about a god born from night. The Greeks would understand, I think, why we talk about death in quiet voices late at night. They did the same, speaking of Thanatos carefully, respectfully, aware that naming something gave it attention. But they also knew that understanding something, even something as final as death, was better than fearing it in ignorance. So rest well tonight. Sleep, that nightly practice of letting go, waits for you with open arms. And Thanatos, his twin brother, waits too, but patiently, without hurry, knowing that his time will come for all of us eventually, but not tonight. Tonight is for sleep and dreams, and the small comfort of old stories told in the darkness, reminding us that humans have always faced these mysteries and found ways to make peace with them. The torch is inverted. The night is deep. The stories are old. And somewhere in the shadows, Thanatos waits, as he always has, as he always will. Neither friend nor enemy, but simply inevitable. The Greeks knew him well, and now so do you. Sleep well.